In this last of three slide lectures on social network theory, method, and application, I'm going to talk about two projects that were conducted in Hartford by our institute, one for which I was the PI, and the second for which Dr. Margaret Weeks, who current director of ICR, was the PI. That show you the kinds of questions we ask and what some of the results were from these studies. Okay, so first one was a study, an earlier study of HIV exposure among older adults in senior housing. We knew that since we had been involved in neighborhoods around senior housing doing research on drug use and commercial sex work and exchanges, that there was a lot of HIV risk behavior in the environments around those senior adult buildings. So we were interested in seeing to what extent some of the people on the street said that they entered the building sometimes to shoot up, sometimes they had relatives in the buildings, sometimes they were seeking sanctuary, and sometimes they were seeking sex with members of the residencies of these senior housing buildings. So we were interested in exploring those relationships, and the best way to do that, we thought, was through network research. So our assumptions for this study were that, first of all, older adults, unlike the thinking, say, back about 15 years ago, older adults continue to be sexually active well past the age of 50. That assumption is now being questioned, but it's slow to come. And the second thing is that buildings, mainly in urban areas like Hartford or even small urban towns, are located in areas in which high-risk behavior is going on. So you can call them high-risk neighborhoods, but really the risk lies in the circumstances of people who are involved in unprotected sex and unclean practices when they're sharing their works and using drugs. So we also assumed that residents do have access to drugs and commercial sex, that they don't know that much about risk for HIV, and that even small numbers of drug users or people involved in who might be infected, who are involved in sex, can diffuse risk through interconnected building residents of people who are, at the very least, involved in sexual behavior with each other. So we did a study of a total of about 10, 11 buildings in Hartford and Chicago, and we thought that through that analysis, we'd be able to show the entry of sex risk into buildings. So what did we do? Well, we selected 5 buildings in Hartford. The residents were ranged between about 45 and 90. Some are called seniors, 62 and over, which is a criterion for getting access to an apartment in one of these buildings, or younger disabled, again, another criterion for access. So every resident was approached in each of our study buildings to participate in the study. We were able to encourage because it was a sensitive topic, about 40% of the residents did not participate. So we had an incomplete network picture of the residents in each of the buildings, and that percentage varied from building to building slightly. So the questions we asked involved HIV knowledge, exposures through drug use, through unprotected sex, information from each person interviewed in relation to every single other person in the building. So we then were able, with that information, to look at the connections among people in the building who responded, and also connections among people who responded and those in the buildings who did not respond. But we didn't have the feedback or the information about those who did not respond about the other egos in the building. So I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but we paid participants $10 $15 in total was a good price at the time of the study, about 15 years ago. And we also looked closely at the environment of the buildings ethnographically and mapped the buildings and asked people where risk behavior might take place in the buildings, in the hallways, in the stairwells, in the bathrooms, in the community room, and so on. So this is information on one building. So the demographics are not so important. The most important point here is that out of 116 residents, according to the management, 68 people participated. Their mean age was almost 70. They were about split between men and women. This particular building, more than half the members of the building were African American, but there was a pretty substantial percentage of Puerto Ricans, and so on. So the network size, the average network size was about 5 people, but a recent analysis that I did shows that it varies considerably depending on age, on gender, and on whether somebody sees a commercial sex worker or not. So here is one of the buildings, and it's a little, it takes time to see this, but you can see that where there is no surround, the people, so if you see number 111 in the middle and 15, these are English-speaking women. There really are no brown circles, few Spanish-speaking women. The gray boxes up there you can see around the edges are women who were not interviewed but who other people had connections to. The red boxes are English-speaking men, and you can see quite a few red boxes. So they would be mostly African American and Caribbean. The green circle is Spanish-speaking men, and the blue diamond is men like the women who were not interviewed but who were connected to others. So the first thing you see in this building as you're looking is that the English-speaking men are dispersed throughout. Some of them are even isolates over there on the right-hand side. And the Puerto Rican, the green circle, they're maybe Puerto Rican and other Latino men are pretty tightly connected. So that is the pattern that is a reverse of what we actually see on the streets. And some of that has to do with the fact that many of the Latinos were Spanish-speaking, so language is always an interference. So here's a picture of who had sex with who, and you can see that there's a very limited amount of partnership in these buildings. So people do have engaged in a variety of intimate behaviors in terms of intercourse with others, but not necessarily in the building itself. So here you can see contact with commercial sex workers. So unfortunately, these blue squares are really red squares, but the colors have changed slightly. So you can see that it's English-speaking men who are having sex with commercial sex workers. That's what those red arrows mean. And if all of their partners are outside the building. And you can see that none of the green circles, who are those Spanish-speaking men, have sex with commercial sex workers, as reported. So here you can see condom use. So the most important thing is to look at the green squares. These are the people who have sex with commercial, well, not all of them, they're sex with commercial sex workers who always use the condom. The reds are the people who have sex mostly with commercial sex workers who do not ever use a condom. So you can see that risk transpires through those interactions. The big question is it coming into the buildings? So the answer is basically no. There was one person who was HIV. We also, as you saw earlier, we measured HIV status. One person was HIV infected, was having sex with a commercial sex worker. That person, number 56, and was not having any relationship of a sexual nature with others in the building. So in that building, the initial hypothesis that that risk was entering the buildings and being diffused through those networks is not evident. So basically, these are some of the conclusions, but the primary conclusion is that risk is found outside the buildings, but it's not being transmitted into the buildings through those networks. So there were some limitations to the study. Some people didn't want to talk about drug use, even though because of our own staff, we knew that they were using drugs or had used them. It's illegal in the buildings. And we may have lost some of the people who are most at risk because they didn't want to participate. So the next study was a network intervention with active drug users, Dr. Weeks' study. And the earlier study was NIA funded. This one was NIDA funded. So the goal was to work with active heroin and cocaine users to create and disseminate various messages, HIV, hepatitis, TB, and STD prevention, STI prevention information through drug-using sites and networks to change high-risk behavior. So this was a study that followed a study where we were able to observe high-risk drug sharing behavior in high-risk sites, which were places like crack houses and abandoned buildings and old warehouses and so on. So the idea was to train people to go into those settings and diffuse messages. So that's basically it. So people were identified, they were trained, data were collected on them and their own networks, and we used a sampling method called RDS sampling to obtain a representative sample of their networks and the networks of their networks. So they then went out with staff to deliver messages. The process was observed, and there are publications on those observations. And then at the end, a community-wide study. All the people who were involved, I should say that all the people who were involved in those networks, all the way out to maybe the third or fourth node, were followed and interviewed, and including the contacts of the PHAs, and then a cross-sectional survey was conducted in the community just to see how far in the broader community, how far the information and changes in behavior had actually gone in that community network of drug users. So here are some of the demographics. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it. You can see there's a split between Puerto Ricans and other Latinos, about 50, 55, 40. The population was primarily African American, Puerto Rican. Most people were unemployed. About half of them had been diagnosed with an STI. A number of them had hepatitis C. Some were HIV positive, and many of them had been in drug treatment in the prior 6 months. And the population was primarily, it was more heavily male than female. So you can see the health, the public, the PHAs. There were 112 of them, and then you can see their contacts. The demographics are slightly different. So there were, each person had about 3 or 4 contacts that were also studied, and so on the right-hand side you can see the totals. You can see what happened between the baseline and 6 months. So you can see that there was a significant drop in the sample in the study, that is the PHAs and their contact referrals, over that 6-month period. So across the board with all of these different risk behaviors, except for shared drug solution. So this is the network, the primary connected macro network of drug users in the community. And it's not here coded by ethnicity, although that can be done because all of the attributes were available in the data set. But you can see that the triangles are the PHAs, those people who are trained to communicate prevention messages, and the contacts are the circles. So you can see there are more circles than triangles. So this diagram is color-coded by drug behavior. So you can see it's hard to sort of differentiate the injectors and the crack users in both. But anyway, that's not so important. But still, the injectors are involved in the highest risk behavior because of the possibility of exchange through needles and works. So on the left-hand side, these PHAs used a flip book, which consisted of a series of messages that were tailored to the person. in the networks that they identified in the settings that they frequented. And so you can see that 76 PHAs used the flipbook, and many more of their contacts. Well, you can see the red are the people that were exposed to the flipbooks. You can see those in the total network, a high level of participants in that macro network were exposed to the flipbook, and somewhat fewer participants were exposed to the health talks. So here you could probably look at the people that were exposed to both, but this analysis didn't show that. So here are the outcomes, changes in talking to a PHA. So you can see that this is a report based on the survey. So some people are the public health activists, advocates, some people are their contacts, and some people are others, because that general survey included every drug user that was selected through an RDS sampling protocol. So you can see that the percentage of risk reduction for prior 30 days is highest for the PHAs. It's also high for the contacts. These are all more or less significant. Stop work sharing is borderline. The IDU risk reduction is not quite as good as the reductions at the top, but still there are significant changes. And so for the others, again, the drop is not quite as steep. So, but I think for reduced drug use, you can see still a reduction for others, which probably means that there is some diffusion of messaging going on to others who are the contacts of the CRAs. So that information told us that this is a very feasible, accessible, acceptable, and successful approach for reaching active drug users in the community through training people who are willing to disseminate messages to their peers, which diffuse through their peers to others in the community. So with that, I will close. I think you have some literature that you can look at, and you can track the references in the literature that I provided if you want to see other similar examples of this type of research. Thank you.